How are you guys finding today? How's today going? Are you enjoying the snacks?
Yes. Excellent, Joyce. Thank you. Being so thoughtful.
You're welcome.
Everybody has their photo summit?
Yep.
Okay, we are now live, Alex.
Okay. Thank you all for coming today to the Green Sprint first presentation in our Sustainable Innovation Speaker Series. We have Richard Adamson from Young Henrys joining us today. Thank you, Richard. We'll give him in the room today, we've got all of our amazing Green Sprint participants, and I believe some of them are joining us online as well. So Richard is going to talk to us a little bit about Young Henrys' journey to become sustainable, which is aptly what this slide is titled, and talk a little bit about some of the R&D process that they go through, why becoming sustainable is so important to them as a business, how they're making impact in their industry, and then at the end we'll have some time for you to all please ask him questions so that we can kind of understand a little bit more where they're coming from. So Richard, I might let you take it away.
Thanks very much. So Young Henrys started in 2012. We started in Newtown, Stanley Vienmore Theatre. Fairly modest ambitions at that point to really just serve beer at the venue and maybe some of the breweries. Oh, got the other one?
Flip it the other way.
The other way.
Yeah. There we go. That one?
Is that better? Yes, I can hear myself now. Great. So yes, Young Henrys started in 2012. Fairly modest ambitions of really just serving beer at the venue and maybe some of the surrounding pubs in the Newtown area. Since then, we're producing around about 10 million litres of beer a year, and we're available nationally. But really from the outset, we had in mind that brewing is an energy-intensive business, and we would like to be as sustainable as possible. So I just thought I'd run through some of the challenges you have in brewing beer, and the top one is always going to be energy. It takes a lot of energy. We are boiling large volumes of liquid. There's a lot of refrigeration involved in the process as well. So these all need inputs in terms of either electricity or natural gas. We've got steam boilers. So that's one we need to address. Then there's the agricultural side, which we're working with agricultural products. So there's all that transportation involved, making sure you use those ingredients efficiently and looking at the disposal of such ingredients. And then packaging and distribution, there's a lot of cardboard, glass or aluminium involved with getting your beer into the hands of the customer. Obviously the transportation involved in that. Water is a big input, both for actually making the beer and for processing and for cleaning. And then there's the actual CO2 production through fermentation, which we'll get into as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. It can be pretty daunting to start with. We just took the approach of the best way to eat the elephant is one bite at a time. So just take little steps, do the best we can as we go, and always look to improve. Calculating carbon footprint is a good way to start, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And Alex, we've talked about how we go about looking at the footprint for Young Henrys, and there's probably going to be a project in doing that itself. But some other breweries have done it. So New Belgium over in Denver have gone through that process, and you can see some of the measurements here that, if you're looking at for a tree to absorb the amount of carbon dioxide, it would take 2 months for a 6-pack of beer. That type one is worth considering. And then they sort of break it down and looked at all the processing. So glass being a quite intensive, has a large footprint. Paper, cardboard, steel, not as much as the glass on its own. Then emissions for the consumer materials is quite high, and energy use, et cetera, as we go through.
Are you surprised by any of those particular parts of all of the carbon footprint being so high or being so low?
I thought the glass surprised me. And I knew glass is maybe not the best packaging material to use for a lot of reasons. And we know, I think looking at glass, we'll get into that a little bit later, that even if you recycle glass, there's probably not a good secondary market for glass. And that's quite a disappointing thing. And that's something that Australia, I think, needs to look to address, is having that recycling industry, because we used to export a lot of our recycling materials. China has said no to glass. I think Indonesia is knocking a lot back. We need to look at what we're going to use that material for, because there's only a certain amount that can go back into packaging materials. I think it's around the 35% mark. There's only so much road base we need, and that's where a lot of it goes. So what are we going to do with it? That's a big question. But back onto what we looked at, just starting with the top one with energy. So the energy consumption in Australia is probably 38% or greater for the total production cost of the beer. And what sources you go through, obviously we talked about electricity and gas, and I think there's been a lot of noise about natural gas in the energy market in Australia, maybe because it can fire it up a lot quicker than you can a coal-fired power station. So I think for that load balancing, maybe, but on the larger scale, we're probably heading towards exhausting all the easily accessible natural gas in this country. We're getting into the fracking and the rest, and we've also really probably crippled the local market on it as well by signing up a lot of export deals that are on a fixed price. So whilst that price doesn't change, when the supply does, it's the Australian market that gets impacted. So the future of natural gas is probably not great. So looking at ways to use other energy sources, I think, other than natural gas for industry is probably going to be pretty important. As you can see, methane from brewery waste might be a way of replacing that. So that's something we could look at in the future as well. Looking at energy efficiency is obviously a good way to start. So not only just your source, but how you're using it inside. So making sure you reuse the water. So when we put a lot of energy into heating up water, making sure that there's a lot of cooling and heating, making sure we use those heat exchangers to the best impact. Refrigeration, a lot of the times that's with things like soft switches, so things don't really spike in terms of their drawdown. Managing your time of use is also one, so you're not just you're not putting too much load on your power draw all at one time. Trying to be more efficient with your processes, and it's really about if you've got good practices, it's going to make better business sense anyway, because you're going to be saving money. So one of the things Young Henry's got involved with fairly early in the piece was community solar. So Pingala is a group that works with solar panel suppliers and puts together an offering for industry where the solar panels are owned by the community, and the industry leases those solar panels. So we got involved with this. We thought it was a great idea. It generates about 25% of our electricity that we need at the moment. The return on investment for the investors is about 6%. Excitingly, we're about to double that capacity this year. So if you do want to get involved in Pingala, I would suggest signing up to the Young Henry's newsletter, because I think there'll probably only be about 100 slots for investors, and it'll be taken up pretty quickly. We also changed our electricity source. So there's a 150 gigawatt solar farm that was installed up in Queensland, and that was through the Australian Hotels Association. They got a group buy, and given our time of use as opposed to hotels, it made sense to bring breweries on board as well, because we use most of our electricity during the day, and that's when the electricity is being generated. So that works out pretty well. So packaging materials, there's a few options. There's glass, aluminium, and PET. And looking at the numbers for the consumption in manufacturing and the greenhouse gases produced, you see they're all kind of, within QE each other. But I think the interesting thing about aluminium is most of that draw is at the start. It's in the mining phase, and the recycling numbers for aluminium are pretty good. So if we're looking at that, the actual energy saving for aluminium is around that 95% mark, and the material is 100% recyclable. So if we are talking about aluminium cans, they can be turned back into aluminium cans. That's fine. Recycling rates here, I think that's an older number. That's improved pretty dramatically, which is a good thing to see. And then you can see the energy savings there. So that's a good story for, I think for aluminium, it's probably more of a win than glass. PET, there's other reasons I think we should avoid PET. And a lot of them is about like what happens if you don't recycle this material and they end up in the waste stream. Fortunately for the story of the glass, it is non-toxic, but it takes a long time to break down. Aluminium does have a toxicity, about a 50-year breakdown. It goes back into the ground. PET is a little bit more of an unknown. It's a long time to break down. And there's this issue of, well, in fact, the date's undetermined of how long it takes to break down, and there might be this issue with this bisphenol A, which is the interior lining, leaching, and that may have a toxicity as well. So for those reasons, we went for aluminium cans as our package that leaves, the small package that leaves the brewery. We sell a lot of kegs, but right now we do sell a lot of cans. But really, if you're looking at glass, reuse is probably the best model. Every time the bottle gets refilled, that carbon impact, the carbon footprint gets exponentially lower. So I guess what we did for that, and there's something we did from the outset, and in fact, when we first started, the only way you could buy our beer outside of off-tap was through a 2-litre returnable bottle. And that's something we still offer now. It does rely on a local community who drinks near the brewery to bring it back, and they've got to bring it back too. So it takes a little bit of planning, but there's still a dedicated bunch of people that use the 2-litre growlers, which is great to see. So that sort of covers packaging. Looking into water, brewing is a water-intensive process, so it's about 5 to 6 litres of water used to produce a litre of beer. So water efficiency is a pretty important goal in the brewing process. And one of the ways you can do that is really have good clean in place. That's what CIP means, clean in place systems to reuse that cleaning water and make sure you're reusing those chemicals. So we, outside of the clean in place systems we installed a high efficiency brew house. So we're using what's called a mash filter, which is that blue thing on the side there. It looks like a concertina. And that's just a different way to extract the water from the grain, where we would basically turn on the side and squeeze the water out of it. So for doing that process, we can use a lot less water. We actually use less grain too. So there's less environmental impact, and it's in terms of the cost per beer, it's cheaper at the same time. And once that grain has been squeezed, you can see it goes on that little conveyor belt into that bin, and then it's fed to cattle. And in fact, probably up until 2020 when the drought broke, there was some pretty lean times for farmers there, and the spent grain really got them through, which was pretty exciting. And then I guess we're onto what we've been working on for the last couple of years is what happens to the CO2 produced in fermentation. So simple view is that yeast consumes sugar and produces alcohol and CO2. How much CO2? So 1 hectolitre of beer, which is 100 litres, produces about 3.2 to 4 kilos of CO2. And just on the industry side, the cost per CO2 is about $1.40 per kilo. CO2 can be captured and reused. It's used between transferring beer between tanks as well. Being careful about how we carbonate the beer can reduce the CO2 usage. There is one caveat, and that is production cycle from the fermentation until when you actually need it can be out of balance, and we're also producing more than you can probably use in the brewing process as well.
So you guys need CO2 to make beer.
We need
but
CO2 to make beer.
You also produce other CO2 as a byproduct of making that beer.
Yeah, so you'd say, why don't you just capture it and reuse it? Up until recently, the technology to do so has been out of the reach of most breweries, and the payoff or the payback or the return on investment was probably in the 15-year mark. More recently, there's been some small-scale CO2 capture recovery systems available. There's only a few that has probably put that payback into the realm of 18 months or so. But the big question is what we do with that excess CO2 as well. So what we could do is feed some of that CO2 to algae. So algae will consume that, it will produce oxygen. And what I found fascinating when I was looking at algae, when I met the UTS guys, was it seemed like an analogue, or almost like the opposite of what yeast does. So yeast is taking on sugar and producing alcohol and CO2, and algae is taking on CO2 during the photosynthesis and producing sugar and oxygen. So it's almost like, well, what if we got those two working in concert? And that's where the research has been. So we're 3 years into a research project now, and what we have found is the microalgae we've been working with can survive in the brewery conditions, which was pretty exciting because we thought there'd be a lot of dead algae, but it turns out brewers can grow algae, which is quite exciting. We've also found quite a few strains to be able to handle an environment with a lot of CO2. So that was something we didn't know when we first started. And I think, in fact, we found some that can't as well. So quite a few of them didn't make the journey. We found that probably one of the most fascinating things is that just that small footprint of algae produces the equivalent amount of oxygen as a hectare of Australian bush. So if we look at this as using algae in an urban environment, I think can really produce some exciting solutions. And then we're continuing on the research to really look at what the kick-on use of the algae will be. So something that it may look like when we go into scale would be feeding that the CO2 produced of any CO2 emitting industry, whether it be brewing or mining or the like, and putting it through a CO2 scrubber or an algae bioreactor, and then harvesting the algae out of that reaction. So that's kind of a summary of where we're up to now. We've still got a long way to go, I think, in terms of making ourselves better. We've got a lot more measuring to do on that carbon footprint and working out ways that we can lessen that. And hopefully we can come up with some really exciting solutions using algae as well.
Fantastic. Something I noticed, and I actually, to be honest, hadn't seen it until you kind of spelt it. I'm on. Let's do tiny mic to my mouth. And I hadn't really considered that, I guess, till I saw that presentation, is that you as a business have come at this sustainability issue from every single angle that your business impacts. From the footprint that you physically have, your energy use, your water use. That's a big task, and not one that a lot of people undertake. What was one of the biggest motivations for Young Henrys as a business to kind of undertake that?
Doing the right thing, really. I think that was the main thing, and there is added benefits to it as well. So there's a financial benefit. I think every naysayer on sustainability always talks about cost. Every step that we make here is about saving cost, essentially. So businesses should be looking at this as a way of being more efficient and using the resources they have. Waste is dollars going out the window. What can we do with that? How can we make that better? And then the truth of the matter is that consumers care more now than they ever have. So if you can, and be genuine about this too, I don't think greenwashing is ever going to work. people see through it very quickly. So, genuine attempts, I think, will be rewarded in the marketplace.
How important do you think being a sustainable business is now to your business model?
Oh, it's embedded in it 100%. So it's been embraced by everyone from the directors to the logistics guys. Like one of our delivery drivers is the recycling guru and has 4 bins in every room for everything, and make sure that everyone puts the right thing in the right bin religiously. I think it's fantastic to see.
Yeah, fantastic. And do you see some of the steps that you're taking as a business having impact on the wider brewing industry?
Look, we would love to see eventually have an algae solution that we could roll out to every brewery across the world, really. And looking at what that impact could be significant.
Yeah. Do you see a future in the next few years where you guys could go out there and say, this is a 6-pack of beer that is carbon neutral, environmentally friendly? That
would be the ultimate aim, or even net carbon negative would be incredible if we could really fine-tune things and get this algae program working well. It could be a source of carbon credits, which would be amazing.
Fantastic. We might open now for some questions. We've got a microphone, but there's also some questions online. Awesome. Yeah,
I can go ahead. So when you began Young Henry's, was sustainability a focus for you, or was it something that you began to work into your business as it grew?
And this is some online questions?
Yes.
Yeah, so we did always have it from the start. So I think that we started with those returnable 2-litre bottles as a method of getting the beer, and that was the only way you could do it. And as we've grown, we've tried to be more sophisticated about how we go and make sure we're making the right choices. And as I said, we definitely wouldn't hold ourselves up as being the golden children of this at all, but we're doing the best we can.
Oh, cool.
We've got another one here, Alex, if you want to read those. So someone's asking if, with the spent grain, has your team thought of other avenues you could take while utilising circular economy principles?
Other uses for the spent grain?
Yeah, there has been some. So we've had people make dog biscuits out of them. We've had some turn up in bread. I know there is a possibility of looking at another sort of secondary fermentation thing that could occur that might generate us some methane as well. So yeah, there are avenues there other than feeding cattle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've tasted some. Tastes great.
Yeah.
Yes. We might grab the mic over.
I first encountered your product, I think, at a UTS event or maybe Nourish event at St Canis's Church. So what struck me and got my attention was your strong early association with philanthropic endeavours. Was that philanthropy for the sake of being good corporate citizens, or were you cleverly and shrewdly targeting emerging influencers?
I'd like to say a bit of each column, I guess, but I don't know if we were that strategic to start with. I think in terms of like in targeting emerging influences, I think one of the other founders, Oscar, and I, we both come from a rock and roll background, and it was really, a lot of it was driven by wanting to be involved in music, arts and culture, because that was what we were into, and we know how hard it is to make a buck out of the arts. So that was something we wanted to get involved with as well. And then as being in Newtown and wanting to be part of the community of Newtown, I think you're just going to touch those other avenues as well.
Thank you. I love the whole story and the commitment. So the algal biomass, so we've just got that diagram up of your sort of ultimate, what happens to the algal biomass?
Right now, it's going back to these guys to work out what to do with it. Yeah.
It's like what I was kind of heading at is if you put it into the soil and use it to restore and improve soil, basically carbon, the carbon concentration in the soil. You get all these environmental benefits, and if you want to go towards carbon negative, it would be a superb. It should, because like it's a really quite intense benefit. You can hope. There's always a question about, have you locked it away or have you just
We're on top of the ground.
for an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got some promising avenues. We can't really get into too much detail at this stage on where it's going. It's $40 million and stuff, but we're pretty confident at this point that we're getting in some interesting territory on that front.
I think it also depends what species is ultimately the best one that fits. It could be that we get an amazing product out of that species. It could be that the best way is to use it as fertiliser or as a burial method. It's kind of, what it has the best outcomes both environmentally and business-wise, I think is probably the key thing.
It's a nice problem to have.
It is a great problem to have, yeah.
And then something that we can manage, or the breweries can manage as well, and it's going to be able to survive in that CO2 environment at the same time. So there's a lot of factors in play there.
I think we've got 2 more questions.
Yep. So one from our viewers on YouTube, and a few of us have already talked about as well. The relationship between you guys and UTS is interesting. Are there others that you guys have cultivated, or other educational resources or different things that have helped you guys build your business?
I think the UTS one's pretty unique, actually. So outside of that, I do a bit of teaching at TAFE, and I think there's been other research people that wanted to do some work with us, but there's only so much we can do, and we're committed to this algae program. So, yeah.
Got some of the researchers at the back of the room, if anyone wants to. And I've got the final question.
Yeah. I'm really loving the fact that the origin of sustainability being high on your values, even when you started. And it's like really inspiring to hear how truly you're acting on your values. So in terms of the market, like people out there have a whole movement of microbreweries and stuff, and I love the fact that you're sharing it with the TAFE further. But do you think that you could almost explore ambassadorism for like this whole value-based business principle and empowering communities and, people at the TAFE, to actually make business in a sustainable way?
Absolutely. A lot of what you saw today is what we would cover in TAFE. The first step really is to make people aware of, what the challenges are in the industry internally. So when they're starting brewing, that they're mindful of it, and they make decisions around those key challenges, and look to make their businesses more efficient, and ultimately it's going to affect their bottom line as well. So it's about saving money, being more efficient, and as I said before, it's what consumers are looking for, and it's the right thing to do.
Fantastic. And with that, we might give Richard a big round of applause. Richard, if they're wanting to find out more about Young Henry's, your sustainability journey, the Algae Project, your website's the best place?
Got a lot of info on younghenrys.com, and as I suggested, sign up to the newsletter as well, and keep an eye out for the next Pingala share offering.
Fantastic. And always, if you're wanting to learn more about the Green Sprint, Deep Green Biotech Hub, go to our website, and also UTS Startups, who put on today wonderfully. Please visit them as well. And we'll give it one more round of applause. We're out.